The first case is Alex Garces, a 23-year-old tenant in Queens, New York. In Queens, Alex Garces was months behind on rent and living in a shared multi-unit building. His landlord was 71-year-old Edgar Moncayo, an elderly man who had been pressing Garces to pay or move out. Their relationship was tense, with repeated visits and growing frustration over unpaid rent. Neighbors and building staff had noticed arguments and threats in the hallway in the weeks before the fatal encounter. On the day of the incident, Moncayo came to the front steps to speak to Garces about the overdue balance. The confrontation escalated into a heated exchange that was captured on a doorbell camera. Footage shows the argument ending when Garces pushed Moncayo on the stairs, sending him down a flight of steps. Moncayo suffered fatal injuries after the fall. Police reviewed the doorbell camera footage and quickly identified Garces. He was arrested and charged with murder. Doorbell video and witness testimony were central pieces of evidence at trial. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The next case is Frank Walton, a tenant in Skagit County, Washington. Walton had been living quietly in a converted commercial unit that was not meant for residential use. His landlord, 67-year-old Howard Benzel, was a small-time property owner who discovered Walton staying in the space without permission. Tension grew after Benzel confronted Walton about the unauthorized occupancy. Neighbors reported loud arguments and one call to police before the killing, and Benzel had tried to evict Walton. The dispute came to a head when Benzel returned to confront Walton about the living arrangements and unpaid utilities. The confrontation turned violent. Benzel was found having suffered a severe beating, consistent with repeated blows from a blunt instrument. Investigators recovered a tool believed to be the weapon and found physical evidence linking Walton to the scene. Police located Walton through witnesses and forensic matches to the weapon. He was charged with murder after investigators tied him to the beating through blood evidence and witness statements. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The next case is Ashwani Shamlodia, a renter in West Chicago, Illinois. Shamlodia was living in a townhouse where his landlord, Sichang Michael Lee, also had a presence in the neighborhood. The relationship had deteriorated amid rumors of an affair between Shamlodia and the landlady, and property owners had issued warnings about conduct in the unit. Tension around the relationship and control of the home escalated over several weeks. There were heated confrontations reported by neighbors and fire safety complaints before the fatal incident. On the night in question, Shamlodia confronted the landlord and then left the scene before a fire consumed the townhouse. The fire killed Sichang Lee. Fire investigators determined the blaze was deliberately set and detected accelerant patterns consistent with arson. Witness statements, forensic fire analysis, and other evidence pointed to Shamlodia as the person responsible. He was arrested and charged with murder and arson. Courts reviewed forensic findings and witness testimony through trial and subsequent appeals. His conviction was upheld on appeal, and he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The next case is Daniel Walsh, a lodger in Derby in the United Kingdom. Daniel Walsh had been living as a lodger in a house owned by 71-year-old Graham Snell. Their relationship had become strained over money and behavior in the house, prompting repeated complaints from other occupants. Tension escalated into a final confrontation between Snell and Walsh. Neighbors reported hearing a disturbance, and Snell was later reported missing when he failed to collect rent and missed appointments. The situation took a darker turn when human remains were discovered in and around the local area. Investigators identified the remains and linked them to Snell. Forensic evidence and a pattern of concealment tied Walsh to the killing and to attempts to hide the body. He faced charges of murder after police collected DNA and other incriminating evidence. Walsh stood trial on murder charges with forensic testimony and recovered remains central to the case. He was convicted of murder and given an effectively whole-life sentence, reflecting the severity and brutality of the crime. The next case is Monique and Gary Lee, tenants in Omaha, Nebraska. Monique Lee was living in an apartment where the landlady, Karen Jenkins, had recently served eviction papers. Jenkins, a long-suffering landlady, had been attempting to recover possession after unpaid rent. Monique and her partner Gary faced an imminent loss of their home, and resentment toward Jenkins had been building. Neighbors reported seeing Monique speak privately with Jenkins in the days after the eviction notice arrived. On the day of the killing, Monique arranged to meet Jenkins in the flat, having told her she wanted to resolve the dispute. Once inside, Jenkins was attacked and strangled, with police later alleging Gary assisted in the assault. Her death followed closely on the heels of the eviction process and the rising tension between tenant and landlady. Police investigated after Jenkins failed to be seen, and neighbors became alarmed. Evidence, including witness statements and physical clues in the apartment, led investigators to Monique and Gary. Both were arrested and charged with murder. They were tried and found guilty. Both Monique and Gary Lee were convicted of murder and sentenced to long prison terms. The next case is John Jack Heyman, a tenant in Middleton, Wisconsin. Heyman was renting in a small building where conflicts with the property owner had grown over noise complaints and rent disputes. The landlord had attempted eviction, and several confrontations had been reported. Tension escalated during a forced interaction about the tenancy. On the day of the incident, there was an argument that turned violent, according to witnesses. The landlord was killed following the confrontation, and the community reacted with shock at the sudden escalation. Investigators found evidence at the scene that tied Heyman to the killing, and witness statements described the dispute that preceded the death. He was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, the prosecution relied on physical evidence and testimony about the confrontations that led up to the killing. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The next case is Joshua Young, a tenant in Louisville, Kentucky. Young had been living in a rental where repeated disputes over rent and behavior had strained relations with the landlord. The landlord went to confront Young about the situation, and neighbors reported a loud argument that night. Young maintained he acted in self-defense during the confrontation. Police were called after the altercation, and the landlord was found dead at the scene. Ballistics and witness statements became central to establishing what had happened in the moments prior to the shooting. Prosecutors charged Young with a serious offense, while his defense argued self-defense based on the circumstances of the dispute. The court examined forensic evidence and conflicting witness testimony at trial. The court ultimately rejected his self-defense claim and found him guilty of manslaughter. He received a significant prison sentence consistent with that verdict. The next case is Joshua Alfano, a tenant in Torrance, California. Alfano had been in a long-running dispute with his landlord over eviction and access to the property. Tensions and prior complaints were reported by neighbors, and there were repeated confrontations at the rented unit. The relationship deteriorated to the point of a violent encounter. On the day of the killing, the landlord arrived to enforce the eviction, and the interaction escalated rapidly. The landlord was killed during the confrontation. Investigators pieced together evidence from the scene, CCTV where available, and witness accounts to identify Alfano as the attacker. He was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, the prosecution presented a pattern of threats and the circumstances around the eviction. Alfano was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The next case is Daniel Bersano Garcia, a tenant in South London in the United Kingdom. Bersano Garcia had been renting where disputes over rent and behavior had created sustained tension with his landlord. The landlord had attempted to enforce rules and recover owed money, which increased friction between them. Neighbors described repeated arguments and strained relations in the building. A confrontation occurred that culminated in the landlord being killed, after which police were called to investigate a suspicious death. Forensic work and witness statements were used to reconstruct events. Police identified Bersano Garcia through evidence gathered at the scene and through interviews with neighbors who had observed the dispute. He was charged with murder based on the totality of the investigation. The case proceeded to trial with forensic and testimonial evidence forming the core of the prosecution. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a substantial minimum term. The next case is Carl Bestford, a tenant in Gateshead in the United Kingdom. Bestford lived in a tenancy where small charges and arrears had become a point of repeated conflict with his landlord. The landlord had made several visits to address unpaid rent and property issues, and those visits were reported to be tense. The relationship collapsed into a final, violent encounter. On the day of the fatal meeting, the landlord came to the property to insist on payment and to discuss eviction. The confrontation escalated, and the landlord was killed during the encounter. Police were alerted and responded to a report of a disturbance, finding evidence that linked Bestford to the killing. Witnesses and forensic evidence supported the charge against him. He was arrested, charged, and taken to trial. The court found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a lengthy minimum term. These cases share troubling and predictable threads. Many began with small disputes over unpaid rent, eviction notices, or everyday annoyances, and those petty conflicts escalated into irreversible violence. Each victim was an ordinary property owner or manager, trying to collect what was owed or enforce the terms of a tenancy, and they paid with their lives. These stories show the darkest possible outcome of routine housing conflicts and how quickly anger can cross the line into murder. What could have been done earlier to de-escalate these situations? And how can landlords and tenants prevent ordinary disputes from turning deadly? The first case is Alex Garces, a 23-year-old tenant in Queens, New York. He rented an upstairs room from 71-year-old Edgar Moncayo, who lived in the house with his wife. The arrangement had become tense. Garces was months behind on rent, even after Moncayo reduced the payment from $400 to $200 to help with Garces' financial struggles. Friction grew over house rules, especially when Garces' girlfriend and their baby visited and the child was left unattended. After repeated conflicts and a formal eviction agreement, Garces and his brother returned to the house with a drill, hoping to retrieve belongings after being locked out. On the front steps, an argument erupted. The dispute escalated into a physical confrontation, and Garces shoved Moncayo, sending the elderly man tumbling down the stairs. A doorbell camera captured the shove in the moments leading up to it, providing a continuous recording of the encounter. Neighbors had reported prior arguments, and the eviction notice had heightened tensions in the days before the incident. Moncayo struck his head on the sidewalk and later died from a traumatic brain injury. Garces later claimed the contact was accidental, saying he had bumped Moncayo while carrying a mattress, but the video contradicted that account. Metadata and chain of custody records confirmed the footage was authentic and unaltered. Prosecutors presented the recording at trial, and the jury reviewed the video frame by frame. Police preserved the doorbell recording as central evidence. Forensic analysis of the video metadata reinforced its authenticity, and witness statements about earlier conflicts supported the prosecution's narrative. Garces was charged with manslaughter and tried in court. The jury found him guilty after watching the footage and weighing the other evidence. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 22 years in prison. The next case is Frank Walton, a tenant in Skagit County, Washington. Walton rented a commercial unit from 67-year-old Howard Benzel, who owned several small properties in the area. The arrangement was meant for business only, but Walton had secretly moved in and was living there against the lease. When Benzel discovered this and refused to extend Walton's lease, the dispute turned heated. Arguments about unauthorized living and the threat of eviction pushed tensions higher, with Benzel insisting Walton had to leave. On the day of the killing in 2019, Benzel arrived at the property to confront Walton about his continued presence. The confrontation spiraled out of control, and Walton attacked Benzel. Walton beat Benzel with what forensic experts later determined was likely a hammer. The injuries showed patterns of blunt force trauma, with skull fractures that matched the shape and weight of such a tool. Benzel died at the scene. Neighbors reported a disturbance, prompting police to respond. Investigators found evidence of a violent struggle and connected Walton to the murder through forensic analysis of the wounds and the motive tied to his secret residency. Walton was charged with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Over 300 people attended Benzel's memorial, a sign of the loss felt in the community. He was convicted and sentenced to 18 years and 4 months in prison. A housing insecurity analyst explains that technology has changed the way violence between landlords and tenants is investigated and prosecuted. In the past, many disputes ended in conflicting stories, with little physical evidence to prove what happened in a heated moment. But today, the widespread use of doorbell cameras, building security systems, and even neighbors' smartphones means that more confrontations are caught on video or audio. These recordings often provide a neutral, time-stamped record of the key moments, sometimes capturing the very act that leads to a landlord's death. Forensic science has also advanced, making it easier to match weapons or analyze injuries with precision. According to Eviction Lab, 3.6 million eviction filings were recorded in the United States in 2022 alone, each one a potential flashpoint for conflict. As housing costs rise and stress builds, the presence of surveillance and forensic tools means that when violence does occur, the evidence is clearer and convictions come faster. Technology now leaves far less room for doubt or denial, making it much harder for perpetrators to conceal what really happened. The next case is Ashwani Shamlodia, a renter in West Chicago, Illinois. In 1999, Shamlodia, an engineer from India, had been living for several months in a townhouse owned by Sichang Michael Lee and his wife. The arrangement soured after Shamlodia began an affair with the landlady, a secret that soon came to light. When Lee confronted him about the relationship, a heated argument broke out and it ended in violence. Shamlodia killed Lee during the confrontation and then tried to erase what happened by setting the townhouse on fire. Investigators arrived to find the home engulfed in flames, but the fire's origin raised immediate questions. Fire marshals collected samples and used gas chromatography mass spectrometry to detect traces of accelerants, ruling out an accidental cause. The burn patterns showed the fire had been deliberately set in multiple locations, consistent with an attempt to destroy evidence. Shamlodia was charged with murder and arson. In court, he argued the affair was exaggerated and that the fire was not intentional, but forensic reports left little doubt about the cause. His appeals were rejected and the conviction was upheld. He was convicted of murder and arson and sentenced to life in prison. The next case is Daniel Walsh, a lodger in Derby, in the United Kingdom. In 2019, Walsh shared a house with his landlord, 71-year-old Graham Snell. The two had lived together for some time, but neighbors noticed Snell suddenly vanished without a word. Suspicion grew when Walsh gave conflicting accounts about his landlord's whereabouts, and the house remained eerily quiet for days. When police began searching for Snell, Walsh said he had found the body in the bathroom and panicked. Investigators soon uncovered evidence of a far more disturbing crime. Walsh had killed Snell, then attempted to erase all traces by dismembering the body and scattering remains around Derby, some hidden in bins, others dumped in woodland, and some fed to wildlife. Forensic teams recovered bone fragments and tissue, painstakingly piecing together the evidence. DNA profiling confirmed the remains belonged to Snell, linking every location back to Walsh's attempts at concealment. The scale and planning behind the disposal shocked detectives, but forensic science unraveled the cover-up. Walsh was arrested and charged with murder and preventing lawful burial. At trial, the weight of DNA evidence and the brutality of his actions left little doubt. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A fire investigator explains that arson, while often used to destroy evidence, rarely succeeds in hiding the truth. Modern fire science can pinpoint the use of accelerants through chemical analysis, even when flames consume most physical traces. In cases of dismemberment, forensic anthropologists rely on DNA profiling and bone analysis to identify victims and reconstruct events, no matter how scattered the remains. The data tell the story. According to the National Institute of Justice, forensic evidence leads to convictions in over 80% of homicide cases involving deliberate concealment attempts. Whether it is the chemical signature of gasoline left behind in a burned-out room or a fragment of bone found miles from a crime scene, these clues hold up in court. Scientific testimony now carries decisive weight, making it nearly impossible for perpetrators to erase their crimes through fire or concealment. The next case involves accomplices who believed they could outsmart the law, but forensic evidence would again prove otherwise. The next case is Monique and Gary Lee, tenants in Omaha, Nebraska. In 2007, the Lees rented a flat from Karen Jenkins, a landlady known for managing her own properties and keeping careful records. Days before the killing, Jenkins served the Lees with eviction papers, citing ongoing disputes about rent and property upkeep. Communications between Monique and Jenkins showed rising hostility, with Monique insisting they needed more time and Jenkins standing firm on the eviction deadline. On the day of the crime, Monique lured Jenkins to the flat under the pretense of discussing the move out. Once inside, Gary joined them, and together they attacked Jenkins, strangling her. Phone records later confirmed Monique's role in arranging the meeting and Gary's presence at the scene. The Lees left Jenkins's body in the apartment, and it was discovered soon after when she failed to return home. Investigators quickly pieced together the timeline using phone logs, eviction documents, and witness statements from neighbors who saw Jenkins enter the flat but never leave. Key evidence included the phone records and the eviction paperwork showing motive and planning. Both Monique and Gary were charged with murder and went to trial. At trial, evidence of their planning and joint involvement led to convictions for both. They were each sentenced to life plus 55 years in prison. The next case is John Jack Heyman, a tenant in Middleton, Wisconsin. Heyman was in his mid-50s and rented a room in the home of Agnes Bram, an 82-year-old landlady who owned the property on University Avenue. Their arrangement placed them under the same roof, with Bram opening her home to Heyman as a source of extra income. Details about their day-to-day relationship remained mostly private, but evidence at trial showed no clear financial dispute or eviction threat in the days leading up to the killing. In April 2017, Bram was attacked inside her own home. Heyman struck her multiple times in the head, a violent act prosecutors later described as especially brutal. After the assault, he dragged her body to the garage and left her there. Bram's daughter and grandson discovered her body when they came to check on her, and police were called to the scene. Investigators quickly identified Heyman as the primary suspect given his residency and presence in the home. He was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide. At trial, Heyman pleaded not guilty, and his defense argued that another man was responsible for Bram's death. The jury deliberated for about 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Judge John Hyland cited the sheer brutality of the attack and Heyman's actions afterward, stating he could not, in good conscience, allow any chance of parole. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence he continues to serve while maintaining his innocence. The next case is Joshua Young, a tenant in Louisville, Kentucky. In 2016, Young was 21 and lived in a house on Bank Street, renting from a landlord who also housed several other tenants. Tension had been simmering over unpaid rent and disagreements about the landlord's approach to managing the property. Neighbors and fellow tenants described a strained atmosphere, with some blaming the landlord's confrontational style for escalating tempers in the building. On May 16, 2016, an argument over rent broke out between Young and his landlord. The dispute quickly turned heated. Other tenants later told reporters they had heard shouting and seen confrontations that week. Some neighbors said the landlord had been persistent about collecting rent and tensions had been rising. During the confrontation that day, Young pulled a gun and shot his landlord inside the house. The shooting occurred just after noon, with other tenants and neighbors nearby. Police responded to reports of gunfire and found the landlord fatally wounded at the scene. Young was taken into custody soon after. Officers and investigators relied on witness statements from tenants and neighbors to piece together the events. News coverage noted that some tenants stressed the landlord's behavior had aggravated tensions, while others said nothing justified deadly force. Young claimed his actions blurred the line between self-defense and retaliation, but authorities treated the incident as a criminal act. He was arrested and charged with homicide and faced criminal prosecution. The next case is Joshua Alfano, a tenant in Torrance, California. In 2008, Alfano lived in a rented apartment with his landlord, a man in his 40s, and shared the space with a co-defendant, DeLange. Tensions had been growing, though the exact dispute remains unclear. What is certain is that both Alfano and DeLange blamed each other for what happened next. On the day of the killing, the landlord was attacked inside his own home. Alfano and DeLange assaulted him with brutal force, stomping on his chest, punching and kicking him before using a belt to strangle him. They stuffed a ski mask into his mouth, causing asphyxiation. After the killing, they hid the body in the apartment for 4 days and stole the landlord's car, attempting to distance themselves from the crime. Police discovered the body after neighbors reported a foul odor. During questioning, both Alfano and DeLange admitted to handling the body, but each insisted the other was the main aggressor. Forensic evidence and the timeline of concealment left little doubt about their involvement. Both were charged with murder. At trial, the court weighed the prolonged concealment and the callousness of the crime. Joshua Alfano received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The next case is Daniel Brisano Garcia, a 46-year-old subtenant in South London. He lived in a crowded maisonette on Dorset Road in Stockwell, sharing the space with 5 other Spanish-speaking tenants. The landlords were Sonia Butron Calvi, 66, and Edgar Aguilera Daza, 60. As the first COVID-19 lockdown began in March 2020, Garcia's behavior changed. Housemates noticed his growing anxiety about infection risks and his unease over rent payments as the new month approached. Sonia told a friend that Garcia was constantly in a bad mood, and tensions simmered throughout the flat. On April 1, 2020, Garcia returned home after work and encountered Sonia and Edgar in the communal kitchen. A heated argument erupted and voices carried into the stairwell. Neighbors and other tenants later described raised voices and a brief confrontation at the foot of the stairs. The dispute quickly escalated, with Sonia threatening to call the police and other residents frozen with shock. In the moment of escalation, Garcia grabbed Edgar in a necklock at the foot of the stairs and stabbed him repeatedly, while another tenant watched from above. Sonia screamed for him to stop and warned she would call the police. Garcia then turned the knife on her and inflicted fatal wounds in what witnesses described as a frenzied attack. After the violence, Garcia made 6 emergency calls himself and opened the door for police with bloodied hands, apologizing repeatedly. Investigators recovered the murder weapon from Garcia's room, and they found a whiteboard covered in notes about the COVID crisis. Witness testimony and forensic evidence linked him to both killings. Garcia claimed he had been driven by mental illness, but the jury at the Old Bailey rejected that defense. He was convicted of murdering both landlords and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years. The next case is Carl Bestford, a 35-year-old slaughterhouse worker in Gateshead, United Kingdom. He rented an apartment from Simon Meach, a 46-year-old landlord who was known for being fair but firm about rent. Tensions had risen over a minor rent dispute, with Meach insisting on payment and Bestford growing increasingly agitated. On the day of the attack, Bestford invited Meach to his flat under the pretense of resolving the issue. Instead, he produced a large knife and launched what police later described as a savage and frenzied assault. Forensic pathology later revealed attempts at decapitation and wounds so severe that investigators were deeply shocked. Northumbria police called it one of the most brutal crimes they had seen against a landlord, given how petty the dispute had been. Police were called to the flat, and forensic evidence linked Bestford to the attack. He pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted Bestford of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The judge condemned the attack as an act of senseless brutality, and there was no possibility of parole. These tragedies show how unresolved tension over something as basic as rent can turn deadly. In a country where nearly 36% of U.S. households rent, landlord-tenant disputes are part of daily life. These cases show how the line between frustration and irreversible violence can be alarmingly thin, and how ordinary housing problems can spiral into tragedy. What could have been done to de-escalate these disputes, and what responsibility do you think each of us has to diffuse anger before it crosses that line?